The evening sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Hannah Miller's trembling hands clutched an empty basket, her hollow cheeks and threadbare dress telling the story her pride would not. It was 1876, 3 years since the influenza had taken her husband and left her alone to face the harsh realities of frontier life in the Wyoming Territory. Today, desperation had finally overcome her dignity. Hannah stood at the edge of the market, watching as merchants began packing up their wares. The smell of fresh bread from the baker's stall made her stomach clench painfully. 3 days without food had left her weak, and the thought of returning to her small cabin empty-handed again was unbearable. "Please, sir," she whispered to the baker, her voice cracking. "I can clean your shop, mend clothing, anything for a loaf of bread." The baker glanced at her with a mixture of pity and impatience. "Already got help, madam. Can't be giving handouts to every widow in town, bad for business." Hannah felt tears threatening to spill but blinked them back. She was 32 years old and had survived the journey west, marriage, widowhood, and poverty. She would not cry in the middle of the market. "Madam," the deep voice came from behind her. Hannah turned to find herself looking up at a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His clothes were dusty from the trail, and the way he wore his gun spoke of familiarity rather than showmanship. He wasn't from Willow Creek. She would have remembered a face like his. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. "Fill your basket and let me carry it for you." Hannah stiffened. "I'm not looking for charity, sir." A slight smile touched his lips. "Nor am I offering it. I've been riding for 3 days straight and could use a home-cooked meal. I'll buy whatever you need if you'd be willing to prepare some supper." Hannah hesitated, weighing pride against hunger. "I can cook," she finally said. "Better than most, despite appearances." The stranger nodded, replacing his hat. "I'm Vincent Blackwood. Most folks call me Vince." "Hannah Miller," she replied, noticing the way the baker suddenly seemed more interested in their conversation. "My husband was Thomas Miller." "Good man," the baker interjected. "Shame about the fever." Vince Blackwood turned to the baker. "We'll take 2 loaves of your bread, sir, the freshest you have." The transaction complete, Vince guided Hannah through the market, filling her basket with flour, beans, salt pork, potatoes, and even coffee luxuries she hadn't enjoyed in months. With each purchase, Hannah's apprehension mingled with gratitude, though she remained wary of this stranger's motives. "My cabin is just beyond the creek," Hannah explained as they left the market. "It's not much, but it's clean." "That's all anyone can ask for," Vince replied, carrying the heavy basket with ease. The walk to Hannah's small homestead took them through the edge of town and along a winding path that followed Willow Creek. Hannah was acutely aware of how the setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber, and how the man beside her moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to hard country. "You're not from around here," Hannah observed, breaking the silence. "No, madam. Been working cattle drives between Texas and Montana for the past decade. Before that, I rode with the Texas Rangers for a spell." "And what brings you to Willow Creek? We're hardly on the way to anywhere." Vince adjusted his grip on the basket. "Looking for someone, old friend from the war." Hannah nodded, not pressing further. The war had left scars on every community, and men searching for comrades was common enough. Her cabin appeared around the bend, a modest structure with a small vegetable garden that had seen better days. Hannah felt a flash of embarrassment at its humble appearance, but Vince showed no reaction. "My husband built it himself," she said, pushing open the door. "We had plans to expand, but—" "It's a fine home," Vince said simply, setting the basket on the small table. Hannah busied herself lighting the stove and organizing the ingredients for their meal. The familiar routine of cooking calmed her nerves, and soon the cabin filled with the aroma of baking bread and simmering stew. Vince sat at the table, his hat beside him, watching Hannah work. "You mentioned you can work," he said after a while. "What skills do you have, Mrs. Miller?" Hannah stirred the pot before answering. "I sew well enough. Taken mending when I can get it. I can read and write better than most, taught at a school back east before I married Thomas." She paused. "Not many opportunities for a schoolteacher in Willow Creek." "Shame," Vince commented. Education matters out here, maybe more than back east. As they ate the simple but hearty meal, Hannah found herself sharing more about her life, how she and Thomas had come west with dreams of building a cattle ranch, how the harsh winter of '72 had decimated their small herd, how Thomas had worked the silver mines before the fever took him. "And you stayed," Vince observed, accepting a second helping of stew. Hannah nodded. "Where would I go? Back east to a family that warned me against coming west. This is my home now, for better or worse." After dinner, Vince insisted on washing the dishes while Hannah put away the remaining food. The domesticity of the scene struck Hannah as strange, having a man in her home after 3 years of solitude. "I should be going," Vince said once the kitchen was tidy. "Is there a boarding house in town?" Hannah hesitated. "Mrs. Bentley takes in boarders, but her place fills up when the cattle buyers come through. There's the saloon, but not my preference," Vince finished. "I can make camp by the creek." Hannah glanced at the darkening sky. "There's a lean-to behind the cabin where Thomas kept tools. It's not much, but there's room for a bedroll if you don't mind roughing it. Least I can do after the meal you provided." Vince considered her offer. "That would be much appreciated, Mrs. Miller." As Hannah prepared for bed that night, she found herself wondering about the stranger sleeping just yards from her door. There was something in his eyes, a depth of experience, perhaps even sorrow, that resonated with her own. Despite her caution, she felt an unexpected comfort knowing he was near. Morning brought the sound of chopping wood. Hannah dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Vince splitting logs with practiced efficiency, a pile of firewood already stacked neatly against the cabin wall. "You didn't have to do that," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. Vince embedded the axe in the chopping block and wiped his brow. "Noticed your pile was getting low. Winter's coming soon." Hannah couldn't argue with that assessment. The nights were already growing colder, and her preparations for winter had been hindered by her dwindling resources. "I've made coffee," she offered, "and there's enough bread left for breakfast." Over the simple meal, Vince explained his plans. "I'll be in town for a few days, asking after my friend. If you're agreeable, I'd like to take my meals here. I'll provide the food, of course, and pay for your cooking." Hannah considered his proposal. The arrangement would ensure she had food for at least a few days, and the extra money would help with other necessities. "That would be acceptable," she agreed. "And you're welcome to use the lean-to rather than paying for lodging in town." Vince nodded. "Much obliged. I've got business to attend to today, but I'll be back by supper." After he left, Hannah found herself moving with more energy than she'd had in months. She swept the cabin, washed the bedding, and even spent time in the neglected garden, clearing weeds and harvesting the few vegetables that had survived her sporadic attention. In town, Vince moved with purpose. His inquiries led him to the sheriff's office, where he introduced himself to Sheriff James Parker. "Blackwood," the sheriff repeated, studying Vince's face. "You rode with the Rangers, didn't you, during the border troubles?" Vince nodded. "For a time, I'm looking for Harold Wainwright." "Heard he might have settled in these parts." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Wainwright was here all right. Opened the assay office about 5 years back." He paused. "Found him shot dead in his office last spring. Never caught who did it." Vince absorbed this news with a grim expression. "Any leads?" "Nothing solid. Some thought it might be connected to the mining company disputes. Others pointed to personal matters." The sheriff leaned forward. "You knew him well, served together, saved my life at Shiloh." Vince's eyes grew distant. "Wrote to me last year, said he had concerns about some business dealings, asked if I could visit." "Too late now," the sheriff said. "His affairs were settled by the bank, no family to speak of." Vince thanked the sheriff for his time and continued his investigations around town, speaking with the bank manager, the barber, and finally ending up at the saloon, where more candid conversations flowed with the whiskey. By late afternoon, Vince had pieced together a troubling picture. Harold Wainwright had apparently discovered discrepancies in assay reports that favored the Silver Peak Mining Company reports that had convinced many local prospectors and small claim holders, including Thomas Miller, to sell their claims for far less than they were worth. As Vince walked back to Hannah's cabin, he pondered whether to share this information with her. The connection to her late husband made the matter personal, yet he hesitated to bring more grief into her life. Hannah was hanging laundry when he returned, her hair coming loose from its pins in the breeze. Something about the sight made Vince pause. Despite the hardship evident in her thin frame and work-worn hands, there was a quiet dignity to Hannah Miller that commanded respect. Productive day. She asked, noting the thoughtful expression on his face. Found out what happened to my friend, Vince replied, taking some of the wet clothing and helping her hang it. Not the news I was hoping for. Hannah's hands stilled. I'm sorry. Been dead nearly 6 months, shot in his office. Vince watched her face carefully as he added, he was the assayer, Harold Wainwright. Recognition flickered in Hannah's eyes. I remember him. Quiet man, always had his nose in a book when not working. Thomas dealt with him when he was considering selling our claim. Did he? Vince asked casually. And did your husband end up selling? Hannah nodded, pinning a sheet to the line. For less than he'd hoped, but the mine wasn't producing well and we needed the money after losing the cattle. She gave Vince a curious look. Why do you ask? Just trying to understand what Harold was involved in before he died, Vince replied, deciding to keep his suspicions to himself for now. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Vince noticed Hannah mending a shirt with small, precise stitches. The domestic scene stirred something in him, a longing for stability he rarely acknowledged in his wandering life. You're good at that, he observed. Hannah looked up, a hint of a smile on her lips. Years of practice. My mother believed a woman's worth was measured by the evenness of her stitches. And what do you believe? Hannah considered the question, her needle pausing. I believe we're measured by how we face adversity, by whether we maintain our dignity and kindness when the world gives us every reason not to. Vince nodded slowly. Wise words, not wisdom, experience. Hannah tied off her thread. What will you do now that you've learned about your friend? Vince stared into the fire. Pay my respects, then see if I can figure out who might have wanted him dead. You're not a lawman anymore, Hannah pointed out. No, Vince agreed, but he was my friend. And I made a promise. The next morning, Vince rode to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Willow Creek. Harold Wainwright's grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, the only indication that a man of education and principle had once walked among them. Vince knelt beside the grave, removing his hat. Sorry I'm late, old friend, he murmured. But I'm here now, and I aim to find out what happened to you. As he stood to leave, he noticed a figure at the far end of the cemetery, Hannah, placing wildflowers on a grave he presumed was her husband's. He waited respectfully by his horse until she approached. I come every week, she explained, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Seems important to remember. It is, Vince agreed, helping her onto his horse before mounting behind her. The closeness of the ride back to her cabin brought an awareness of each other that neither had experienced in their previous interactions. Hannah was conscious of the strength in the arms that reached around her to hold the reins, while Vince noted the subtle scent of lavender in her hair. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Vince would spend his days in town, gradually gaining the trust of locals and piecing together the events surrounding Harold Wainwright's death. Evenings were spent at Hannah's cabin, sharing meals and increasingly personal conversations as their initial wariness gave way to growing trust. On the fourth evening, as a thunderstorm rattled the cabin windows, Vince finally shared his suspicions. I believe Harold discovered that the Silver Peak Mining Company was falsifying assay reports, he explained, undervaluing the claims of independent miners to buy them cheaply. Hannah set down her coffee cup. Including Thomas's claim, possibly. I can't be certain without seeing the original samples and reports. Hannah rose and went to a trunk in the corner of the room. After rummaging through it, she returned with a small leather pouch and a folded document. Thomas kept samples from every part of our claim, she explained. He was meticulous that way, and this is the assay report from Mr. Wainwright. Vince examined the document carefully. According to this, the silver content was minimal, barely worth extracting. That's what Mr. Wainwright told Thomas, Hannah confirmed. Said we were fortunate the company was willing to buy the claim at all. Vince weighed the pouch in his hand. Would you mind if I had these samples tested again? There's an independent assayer in Cheyenne who owes me a favor." Hannah's expression hardened. "If what you're suggesting is true, then the company cheated not just us, but dozens of families in this area. And Harold might have died for trying to expose it," Vince added grimly. The realization that her husband's death might have been indirectly caused by such fraud brought a new wave of grief to Hannah. Vince, seeing her distress, moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Perhaps I shouldn't have told you." Hannah shook her head. "No, I needed to know. Thomas believed in honesty above all else. He would want this brought to light." Their eyes met, and for a moment the space between them seemed charged with unspoken understanding. Vince reached out hesitantly, covering her hand with his own. The gesture was simple, but profound, an offering of comfort that acknowledged their shared sense of justice. The storm outside intensified, a particularly loud crack of thunder making Hannah jump. Vince's arm instinctively moved around her shoulders, and she found herself leaning into his solid presence. "The storm will pass," he murmured, words that seemed to address more than just the weather. Hannah nodded against his shoulder, allowing herself to accept the comfort of human contact after years of solitary grief. Neither spoke again until the storm began to subside, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The next morning, Vince prepared to ride to Cheyenne with the samples. "I'll be gone 3 days, maybe 4, he told Hannah as he saddled his horse. "Will you be all right?" Hannah nodded, handing him a package of food for the journey. "I survived 3 years on my own." "I think I can manage a few days." Vince smiled at her spirit. "I don't doubt it. Still, I'd feel better knowing you're safe. The people involved in this fraud won't take kindly to someone asking questions." "No one knows what you've told me," Hannah assured him. "I'll be careful." Before mounting his horse, Vince hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag. "I want you to have this," he said, handing her a small revolver. "Do you know how to use it?" "Thomas taught me," Hannah replied, accepting the weapon. "Though I've never had cause to fire at anything but rabbits raiding my garden. Let's hope it stays that way." As Vince rode away, Hannah felt a strange mixture of anticipation and fear. The possibility of justice for Thomas and others like him gave her purpose, while the growing attachment she felt toward Vince both frightened and exhilarated her. The days passed slowly. Hannah kept busy with chores and even visited town to purchase thread with some of the money Vince had paid her for cooking. At the general store, she overheard a conversation between the owner and a well-dressed man she recognized as Howard Prescott, the manager of the Silver Peak Mining Company. "Asking all sorts of questions about Wainwright and the assay office," the store owner was saying. "Big fellow carries himself like a lawman." Prescott's expression darkened. "And you say he's staying with the Miller widow. That's the word around town. Been there nearly a week now." Hannah finished her purchase quickly and left, her heart racing. She needed to warn Vince when he returned that his inquiries had not gone unnoticed. That evening, as Hannah prepared for bed, a noise outside caught her attention. Peering through the window, she saw 3 men approaching the cabin. The moonlight glinted off their guns. Hannah's hands trembled as she retrieved Vince's revolver from beneath her pillow. Moving quietly, she extinguished the lamp and positioned herself beside the window, watching as the men conferred in whispers before one moved toward the door. The knock, when it came, was deceptively polite. "Mrs. Miller, it's Howard Prescott from the mining company. I'd like a word with you." Hannah remained silent, her grip tightening on the revolver. "Mrs. Miller, I know you're in there. It concerns your husband's mining claim. Information has come to light that may entitle you to additional compensation." The lie was transparent, but Hannah knew remaining silent would only delay the inevitable. Taking a deep breath, she called out, "It's late, Mr. Prescott. Come back tomorrow during daylight hours." There was a pause, then Prescott's voice hardened. "I'm afraid this matter is urgent, Mrs. Miller. Perhaps you could invite us in to discuss it." "I don't think so," Hannah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "My business with the company was concluded when my husband sold his claim." A new voice spoke rough, impatient. "Enough of this. Break down the door." Hannah raised the revolver as the door shuddered under a heavy blow. I'm armed, she warned, and I know how to use this. The pounding stopped momentarily. Be reasonable, Mrs. Miller, Prescott called. We simply want to talk about the samples your visitor took to Cheyenne. So they knew about the samples. Hannah's mind raced, calculating her options. The cabin had only one door and two windows, both easily accessible. She was outnumbered, and despite her brave words, had never fired at a human being. The decision was made for her when glass shattered as one of the men broke a window. Hannah fired a warning shot through the door, hearing cursing as the men scattered. Next one won't be a warning, she shouted, hoping they couldn't hear the fear in her voice. The standoff continued, with the men calling threats and demands while maintaining their distance from the door and broken window. Hannah knew they were waiting for her to exhaust her ammunition or her resolve. Just when it seemed the men were preparing for another assault on the door, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone freeze. Hannah risked a glance through the intact window and felt a surge of relief as she recognized Vince's silhouette, rifle raised. Step away from the cabin, his voice commanded, the authority in it unmistakable. Now, Prescott's voice replied, strained with false cordiality. Mr. Blackwood, I presume. We were just having a conversation with Mrs. Miller about some mining business. At midnight, with guns drawn, Vince's horse moved closer, the moonlight revealing his grim expression. I don't think so. This doesn't concern you, the rough voice growled. The lady is under my protection, Vince stated flatly. That makes it my concern. The standoff stretched for several tense moments before Prescott apparently decided retreat was the better option. We'll continue this discussion another time, he called to the cabin. When circumstances are more favorable. No, Vince countered. You won't. Because I've just returned from Cheyenne with proof that your company has been systematically defrauding miners through falsified assay reports. The territorial marshal is very interested in this evidence. Hannah could hear the men muttering among themselves, weighing their options. You're bluffing, Prescott finally said, though with less conviction. Try me, Vince challenged. Or you can leave now, and perhaps when the marshal arrives tomorrow, I'll mention your cooperation. The tense silence broke with the sound of retreating footsteps and horses being mounted. Vince maintained his position until the men had ridden well away from the property before dismounting and hurrying to the cabin door. Hannah, are you hurt? The concern in his voice wrapped around her like a physical embrace. She opened the door, still clutching the revolver. I'm unharmed. Vince entered, quickly assessing the broken window and the bullet hole in the door. Without a word, he pulled Hannah into his arms, holding her with a fierce protectiveness that broke through the last of her composure. She trembled against him, the fear she had suppressed finally surfacing now that she was safe. I shouldn't have left you alone, Vince murmured into her hair. I'm sorry. Hannah shook her head against his chest. You couldn't have known they would come here. She pulled back slightly to look up at him. Did you really speak to the marshal? Vince nodded, keeping one arm around her as he reached into his coat with the other, producing an official-looking document. The assay showed significant silver content in Thomas's samples, enough that his claim was worth at least 5 times what the company paid. The marshal issued warrants for Prescott and the company directors based on this and other evidence I gathered. Hannah stared at the document, emotions warring within her: vindication for Thomas, anger at the fraud, and relief that justice might be served. But overriding all of these was a growing awareness of the man still holding her, whose determination had uncovered the truth and whose arrival had likely saved her life. You came back early, she observed. Rode through the night, Vince confirmed. Something didn't feel right. I needed to make sure you were safe. The admission hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Hannah became acutely conscious of their proximity, of his arms still around her waist, of how naturally she had turned to him for comfort. Thank you, she said simply, the words inadequate for what she felt. Vince's eyes held hers, the intensity in them making her breath catch. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a gentle kiss that asked rather than demanded. Hannah's response was hesitant at first, then increasingly certain as long, dormant emotions awakened within her. When they finally parted, Both were breathing unevenly, surprised by the depth of connection that had formed between them in such a short time. "I should secure the cabin," Vince said reluctantly, his voice rougher than before. Hannah nodded, reluctantly stepping out of his embrace. While Vince boarded up the broken window and reinforced the door, Hannah made coffee, her mind whirling with conflicting thoughts and emotions. When Vince returned to the kitchen, he accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. The marshal should arrive by midday tomorrow. Prescott and his men might try to flee, but the sheriff has been alerted to detain them if they attempt to leave town. And then? Hannah asked, the question encompassing more than just the legal proceedings. Vince set down his cup, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "Justice for Harold and for Thomas and all the others who were cheated," he paused. "As for what happens after that depends on you, Hannah, on me. I came to Willow Creek looking for answers about my friend's death. I wasn't looking for—" He gestured between them. "Whatever is happening between us." Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "And what is happening between us, Vincent?" "Something I thought I'd never find," he answered honestly. "Something I wasn't even sure I was looking for." Hannah's heart raced at his words. "I never expected to feel this way again. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over." Vince reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I have no right to ask anything of you. My life has been unsettled, moving from place to place. But meeting you has made me question whether that's what I want anymore." The admission hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibility. Hannah found herself imagining a future that just days ago would have seemed impossible, one where loneliness was replaced by companionship, where her days had purpose beyond mere survival. "What are you saying, Vince?" "I'm saying that when this business with the mining company is settled, I'd like to stay, if you'll have me." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Not just as a boarder or a friend, but as someone who wants to build something lasting with you." The directness of his proposal took Hannah's breath away. "We've known each other barely a week," she pointed out, though her heart was already racing ahead of her cautious words. "I've learned more about you in that week than I've known about anyone in years," Vince replied. "I know you're strong, stubborn, kind, and proud sometimes to a fault." His lips quirked in a half smile. "I know you hate accepting help but will give everything you have to someone in need. I know you're loyal to a fault and believe in justice even when it seems impossible." His words touched Hannah deeply. "And I know you're honorable," she responded softly, "that you keep your promises, that despite your dangerous past, there's a gentleness in you that few people see." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Finally, Hannah squeezed his hand. "I don't know what the future holds, Vince, but I'd like to find out, together." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Together," he agreed. The night passed peacefully, with Vince keeping watch while Hannah slept. By morning, word had spread through Willow Creek about the impending arrival of the territorial marshal and the allegations against the mining company. The town buzzed with speculation, and in many cases, long-suppressed suspicions about the company's practices. When Marshal Edwards arrived, accompanied by 2 deputies, the evidence Vince presented resulted in the immediate arrest of Howard Prescott. 2 company directors were detained while attempting to leave town, and a thorough investigation of the company's records was ordered. For Hannah, the following weeks brought dramatic changes. The territorial court ruled that the mining company must make restitution to all those defrauded by the false assay reports. As Thomas Miller's widow, Hannah received a settlement that transformed her financial circumstances overnight. "What will you do with it?" Vince asked as they sat on the porch of her cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues. Hannah considered the question. "Some will go toward improving this place," she decided. "The rest I'd like to use to establish a proper school for the children in Willow Creek." She glanced at him. "What do you think?" "I think it's perfect," Vince replied, his arm around her shoulders. "This town needs more than just silver to build its future." As autumn turned to winter, Vince and Hannah's relationship deepened. He added a proper bedroom to her cabin, expanded the barn, and helped her establish the town's first dedicated schoolhouse. Hannah, for her part, discovered that opening her heart again didn't diminish the love she had felt for Thomas, but rather honored his memory by embracing life fully. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, Vince knelt before Hannah with a simple silver ring. "I know it hasn't been that long," he began, his usually steady voice betraying his nervousness, "but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Hannah Miller. Will you marry me?" Hannah's eyes filled with tears as she cupped his face in her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Their wedding in early spring was attended by the entire town. Hannah, radiant in a new blue dress, and Vince, imposing yet gentle in his best suit, exchanged vows beneath a canopy of blossoming apple trees behind their now expanded cabin. Sheriff Parker, who had become a good friend to them both, served as witness. "Never thought I'd see the day Vincent Blackwood settled down," he remarked during the celebration. "Must be something special about Willow Creek." "Not Willow Creek," Vince corrected, his eyes finding Hannah across the gathering. Her. As the seasons passed, Hannah and Vince built a life together that neither had dared imagine when they first met that fateful day in the market. The school flourished under Hannah's guidance, while Vince established a horse breeding operation that soon gained recognition throughout the territory. They faced challenges, of course harsh winters, occasional drought, and the normal difficulties of merging two independent lives. But they faced them together, their bond strengthening with each obstacle overcome. 2 years after their wedding, their joy was multiplied with the birth of their daughter, Catherine, followed 18 months later by a son they named Harold Thomas, honoring both the friend whose death had brought them together and the husband whose memory Hannah still cherished. On the 5th anniversary of their first meeting, Vince surprised Hannah by taking her to the market where they had met. The town had grown considerably, with new buildings and businesses lining the once dusty Main Street. "Remember that day?" he asked as they stood at the spot where a desperate widow had begged for bread. Hannah nodded, her hand securely in his. "I was at my lowest point, too proud to accept charity but too desperate not to try. And I was just passing through," Vince mused. "Looking for answers about the past, not thinking about the future." Hannah leaned against him, watching their children examine the candy display in the general store window. "Do you ever regret staying, giving up your wandering life?" Vince turned to her, his eyes as clear and certain as the day he had proposed. "Not for a single moment. You and the children are my home, Hannah, the only one I've ever truly needed." As they walked back to their thriving homestead, now a proper ranch with grazing horses and abundant crops, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From a woman begging for bread to the respected schoolteacher and wife of one of the territory's most prosperous horse breeders, it seemed almost like a dream. Yet the reality was better than any dream she could have imagined. The love between them had only deepened with time, weathering the inevitable storms of life to emerge stronger and more resilient. That night, with their children asleep and the house quiet around them, Hannah and Vince sat on their porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. His arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him, they shared the comfortable silence of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. "I was thinking," Vince said after a while, "about expanding the school building. The town's growing and more families are settling nearby." Hannah smiled at his constant support of her passion. "I'd like that, perhaps add a library section as well." "Whatever you want," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You know I can deny you nothing." Hannah turned in his arms, meeting his gaze in the silvery moonlight. "I already have everything I could want," she said softly. "A home, our children, purpose in my work." Her hand rose to caress his cheek, still rugged but now bearing the lines of laughter as much as hardship. "And you, Vincent Blackwood, the man who offered to carry my basket when I had nothing to fill it with." Vince captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Best decision I ever made." As they sat together under the vast canopy of stars, Hannah reflected on how life's darkest moments sometimes led to unexpected light. Her desperate plea for bread had led to nourishment not just for her body, but for her soul a love that had transformed emptiness into abundance, solitude into connection, and grief into joy. The basket that had once been empty was now overflowing, not just with the necessities of survival, but with the luxuries of a life fully lived and deeply loved. And though the path had been neither straight nor easy, every step had led precisely where they were meant to be together, under the wide Wyoming sky, their futures as boundless as the horizon.